All right, so since we've just got done talking about the leaf, now we're going to take a closer look at what goes on inside the chloroplast and how the chloroplast structure allows for photosynthesis. So photosynthesis as a process, which is taking sunlight's energy and using it to combine carbon dioxide and water together to make sugar, that process requires certain structures to allow it to happen. Things can't just happen in a void or by magic. They need cellular structures to allow them to occur. So it's the structure of the chloroplast that allows photosynthesis to take place because, number one, chlorophyll and other what we call accessory pigments are organized together within that thylakoid membrane. Remember, the chloroplast has those stacks of coins looking things, those stacks of membranes. The stack is the grana, and the individual membrane is the thylakoid. And so within that thylakoid membrane, because it's a membrane, remember, with a bilayer of lipids, just like we talked about in the other chapter, how membranes are constructed, and there are proteins in membranes. Well, pigments are complexes of molecules, including proteins. And so these clusters embedded in the membrane are referred to as photosystems. So chlorophyll, the accessory pigments, and the proteins associated with capturing sunlight are all clustered together, and we call that cluster a photosystem. And so the photosystem is actually the light harvesting unit, the solar panel of the chloroplast, if you will, right? They collect the light. Now, the question is, okay, when they collect the light, what happens to it? Again, it's not magic. Something has to occur. So when sunlight strikes that photosystem, the energy of the sun gets transferred to the chlorophyll. And so within the chlorophyll, because remember, chlorophyll is a molecule. Molecules are made up of atoms. Atoms have electrons. So there are electrons in the chlorophyll, and when those electrons absorb that energy, they become excited, right? Excited simply means absorbed energy and are now very unstable and move to that next orbital of the atom. They have gained a lot of energy. And so those high energy electrons have to go someplace. They need a carrier to grab them and hold them until we can use their energy. If you do not grab these electrons once they've been energized, like almost immediately upon energizing, they will just give off that energy as heat or light and fall right back down to their ground normal state. So those high energy electrons need a carrier. And so electron carriers are molecules that the cell uses to transport these high energy electrons from one place to the next. Okay, so it's a compound that can take those high energy electrons and transfer them and their energy to something else. They're like the taxi, the electron taxi of cell processes. And so this process is called electron transport. And the main electron carriers are known as the electron transport chain. There are others, but the main one that's going to harvest the energy of those electrons is called the electron transport chain. Another electron carrier that's a little bit more temporary and intermediate is called NADP+. You don't need to know what it stands for. It's a long word, nicoadenine dinucleotide phosphate. You can just call it NADP. NADP will take electrons and a hydrogen. You don't have to worry about two electrons or anything like that. Just know that it picks up electrons and hydrogen. And when it does, NADP becomes NADPH, right? That makes sense. If it's picking up a hydrogen, we're going to change its name by adding a hydrogen to it. So NADP plus will pick up electrons and a hydrogen, and we then call it NADPH. And so NADPH can carry those electrons someplace else in the chloroplast to be used, okay? And those high energy electrons are what we're going to use to make glucose, because to make a complex molecule like glucose requires energy. And so the energy that we're going to use comes from NADPH, or those electrons that NADPH is carrying. So overall, right, we got two stages of photosynthesis. The light-dependent reactions, and they take place on the thylakoid membrane. And then the second half of the process is called the light independent reaction. Used to call it the dark reaction, but that was confusing. People thought it took place at nighttime. It doesn't. It's also called the Calvin cycle. It just takes place, it can take place without light. That's why we call it the light independent. So light dependent requires light. Light independent can happen without light. And this takes place in the stroma, which is that fluid-filled region outside the thylakoids, but inside the chloroplast. So the whole process of photosynthesis takes place within the chloroplast. So in this image, right, there's our chloroplast, there's the grana, right, the stacks of the thylakoids, and there's the stroma. So those are the two locations where our two processes of photosynthesis are going to take place. We need light energy for the light-dependent reactions to take place. That also requires water. So the plant absorbs water. We use that in the light-dependent reactions, and they make oxygen as a byproduct. NADPH is made in the light-dependent reactions, but then used in the Calvin cycle. ATP is made in the light-dependent reactions, but used in the Calvin cycle. The Calvin cycle is where our carbon dioxide actually gets converted into sugar. And once we use the ATP and the NADPH, what's left over goes back to the light-dependent reactions to get recycled. So we're going to talk about these processes in detail coming up.